Está bem.
É como, sabes, é como quando tu entras num concerto e a orquestra está
A
a
fazer os
terminar.
acertos finais, não é?
Exato.
Por acaso eu gosto muito dessa altura, quando eles estão a fazer aqueles acertos finais. Por
Também
acaso gosto
eu,
muito.
também eu. Então, a ver se aquilo tudo bate certo e não sei o quê, e ensaiar os últimos ensaios. E é um pouco como isto, nós só vamos.
Eu acho que
Ah,
estou a ouvir.
olha, estás a ver? Ainda bem que eu liguei mais cedo,
Ok.
porque eu estou com.
Um delay muito grande.
Mas espera lá, é que para já este som não se devia estar. És tu que estás no YouTube?
Não.
Vê lá, desliga o teu YouTube.
Já está. Se calhar era eu, era.
Sim,
Pronto,
desliga.
ok. Já está.
Pronto,
Pronto,
mas de
ok.
qualquer maneira, foi bom até termos ligado um bocadinho mais cedo,
É,
porque
isto são estes pequenos erros que depois uma pessoa no momento pânica e ninguém se lembra das coisas mais óbvias. Mas ok. Pronto, mas é
olha,
isso.
sabes uma coisa que eu também me esqueci de te pedir? É para tu escreveres no teu nome José Luís Silva.
No PowerPoint.
Não, no próprio Zoom, porque isso vai ficar gravado. Estás a
Ah,
ver? É que vais aos participantes no Zoom e fazes
participante.
renomear. E pões em vez de José Luís só, pões José Luís Silva.
Já está.
Pronto. Agora sim, estamos prontos e falta um minuto, portanto estamos mesmo para começar. Ora, muito boa tarde. Dou-vos as boas-vindas ao Seminário de Cultura Material da Ciência de outubro do Museu Nacional de História Natural e da Ciência. O meu nome é Marta Lourenço, sou a diretora do museu. Hoje vamos ter a presença de um tema e de um convidado, ambos muito especiais. Vamos falar sobre identificação de madeiras por Luís Silva, que está a trabalhar a fazer doutoramento na Universidade Católica Portuguesa, Centro Regional do Porto. Esta sessão foi anunciada como sendo em inglês e, portanto, vou rapidamente mudar para entrarmos no seminário. As perguntas, claro, que podem deixar no chat, em qualquer momento, podem ser em português ou em inglês. So, welcome. Today we have Luís Silva, a PhD student at the Portuguese Catholic University of Porto. He has background training in the arts, communication and design, more specifically landscape training. And he's also an entrepreneur. He is the CEO of conservation, restoration, and decorative arts company, CADMU, Decorative Systems. Thank you so much, Luís, for accepting our invitation for this seminar.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me for this initiative. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure. So, in the world of arts, conservation, restoration, museums, the identification of wood from which an artwork, say, for example, a painting or a sculpture, is made is paramount because it offers precious historical information about location, date, and sometimes even author or intention. More generally, wood identification is incredibly important, for example, to fight illegal traffic. It's hard to believe, and in fact, I didn't even know before I talked to Luís the first time, that there are so few tools available to identify wood, namely identification protocols or a reference collection, for example. So our guest, Luís Silva, is doing a PhD about this subject, and I want to talk to him about precisely what is going on about the context of his topic, the identification of wood, the volume, the dimension of the problem, and what is being done to mitigate it. I think he's the best person to guide us through this field. And I would now ask Luís to start your presentation, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Essentially, I'm going to do a small summary of what is wood identification, what tools are available, and what are the results that we can obtain with those tools for identify wood for art or whatever the purpose. So I'm going to start this presentation. I'm going to read most of this presentation. Let me share the canvas, please. I'm going to read most of this presentation, and because it's a lot of information, but in the end, we can obviously have a normal conversation. Any questions that you may have, just shoot them out and I will answer the best I can. Okay?
Absolutely. Go ahead. Tell us.
Okay, very well. So let's start with the first question. What is scientific wood identification? What people must understand is that wood must be understood as a complex tissue constituted by a multiplicity of different cells with different purposes and visual aspects, and is through the analysis of its microstructure, mainly, as well as the identification and quantification of the chemicals accumulated in those tissues, that we can access the family first, the genus, and then ideally the species. Scientific wood identification resorts to a multiplicity of methodologies and techniques that allow a substantiated and, above all, repeatable identification of woody material. It can be said that the interest for the anatomy of wood began, to the best of our knowledge, in the ancient Greece with thinkers like Aristotle, but especially with Theophrastus of Ephesus, which was the first one defining elements such as vessels and fibers in wood. Another relevant name was the Roman Caio Plinius II, which was the first one describing the difference between hardwood and sapwood, as well as naming essential oils and knots, for example. However, wood identification with a scientific perspective only effectively started around the 17th century, when the Italian Marcello Malpighi analyzed vegetable material under a microscope for the first time. The 20th century brought, among other developments, the dichotomous keycard method, where a response to one of two questions concerning physical characteristics of the sample leads the researcher to the next question. When all the questions are answered correctly, the researcher invariably reaches an identification of the item. Essentially, in wood identification, one of the first questions is the presence of vessels, for example, right? If the sample has vessels or does not have vessels. If it does have vessels, the following questions will guide us towards the angiosperm species, in other words, hardwoods, that present vessels. If it does not have vessels, the following questions will guide us for the gymnosperm species like conifers and others. So one answer will lead you to other questions for a specific trail. Very well. Presently, these dichotomous keys are available online, which highly increase the speed and precision of the identifications. But within the realm of anatomical analysis of wood, several methods can be pointed out. Macroscopy can be described as the oldest method of them all. It concerns the analysis of the external wood features visible with a naked eye or with the help of hand lenses with variable magnifications, usually between 20 magnifications and 40. Higher magnifications in this case are usually useless because of the natural shaking of our hands. This method usually allows identifications to the genus levels only. On the other hand, microscopy, as the name suggests, analyzes and identifies the microscopic elements that constitute the structure of the wood. With this method, that usually uses magnifications between 200 to 800, we obtain a great amount of information, which allows species identification, or at least genus identification. The analysis of the wood characteristics under a microscope is the best known and the most widely used technique, and is still today used to prove the results of other techniques. Historically, microscopy performed in biology required 3 samples with an average size of 1 cubic centimeter, which is a lot, especially when dealing with art. Corresponding each one of these sample blocks to one of the required plan cuts needed for the observation and recognition of the anatomical features in wood. As you can see in the picture on top, is the transverse or cross section, the X, the radial section, the R, and tangential section, the T. A blend between these 2 methodologies is what's being done at the Universidad Politécnica de Madrid, more specifically at Escola Técnica Superior de Ingeniería de Montes, Florestal y del Medio Natural, under the supervision of Dr. Luis Garcia Esteban and Dr. Paloma Palacios, one of my supervisors in my PhD. In here, they are using high magnification cell phone attached lenses of between 200 and 400 magnifications to access microscopic features of wood samples, avoiding in that way the need to go through the procedures to obtain wood histological sections that will be mentioned next. The objective of is to feed an AI software in development, the EMI app, to obtain automatic wood identification results. The final goal is to make law enforcement agencies capable of detecting trafficked wood species in a faster, reliable, and cheaper way. The pictures that you are seeing here are pictures of my samples that I took from sculptures with 300, 400-year-old. And as you can see, the quality of the anatomy and the microscopic features visible is amazing with this technique. And with this, we can, in a faster and cheaper way, to have access to these microscopic elements that with a typical microscopy could be, it is always a very time-consuming and expensive technique. These results obtained with this still developing technology are very promising. Then we have another technique, which is known as scanning electron microscopy, better known as SEM, which is a technique that produces impressive results when the goal is the analysis of specific details in 3 dimensions, mainly because the relative easiness to achieve around 3,500 magnifications. A feature to bear in mind with this technique is that scanning electron microscopes work in a vacuum, so it can cause very degraded wood samples to collapse. In my case, this is an important information. However, an alternative to avoid this issue is the use of low vacuum SEM. Wood dissociation, on the other hand, is a methodology that is aimed at the detail and individualized observation of the different types of cells. Essentially refers to the separation of the different tissues that make up the wood using specific solvents and procedures. An example of where this technique becomes essential is when it is needed to measure the length of fibers, tracheids, fiber tracheids, vessels, etc. It is also essential when the available sample is too small or too degraded for identification, even with embedded resins. Since we are talking about embedding resins, these high penetration resins are used when the sample available is so small that handling it is not feasible, or when it is in a state of degradation that makes further identification procedures, as sectioning, impossible. These pictures that you are seeing here are pictures that from samples that I took from sculptures in my master's degree. In particular, this technique is used when dealing with archaeological wood, waterlogged wood, charcoal, or wood heavily infested by xylophagous insects or infected by fungi. Here you have some pictures of the results that we can obtain with these techniques. It is important to mention, however, that with the constant advance of technologies and knowledge, several techniques, visual or analytical, are available today and in constant development, delivering an ample array of results. Among others, we are talking of techniques such as mass spectrometry, X-ray microtomography, chromatography, DNA barcoding, and computer-assisted wood identification, which resorts to artificial intelligence. However, beyond the natural difficulty to distinguish and identify the several different tissues within the wood structure, factors such as morphological defects of the trunk, the first picture, reaction wood and compression wood, wounds, the picture in the middle, or knots, the picture in the bottom, or damage caused by animals, human action, among others, can, to different degrees, modify the internal structure of the wood, the number of elements per square millimeter, or the usual appearance of a particular tissue type. This is important because, in my case, in the old days, a wood carver not usually, but frequently use an entire trunk to carve a sculpture. And today, when I'm going to collect a sample of wood to identify that wood, I cannot, as you will see further, I cannot choose the place to take that wood sample. I have to limit myself to cracks or holes or whatever I have access to. So I can have the bad luck of remove a small sample, and that small sample comes from one of these areas that presents a completely different anatomy, and that can be an extra problem to resolve. But wood identification is today required by several areas, being the most common, naturally, biology, right? Obviously. Biology uses species identification to identify and distinguish species among each other, identification of protected species, and illegal trade control of protected species, among many other areas. However, archaeology, in this case, use wood identification to identify, for example, the wood of extremely important archaeological findings, such as the top pictures, the oldest known sculpture found to date, Shigir idol, found in what is today Russian territory. It's made of large larex and dated close to the beginning of the Holocene, around 10,000 years ago. Or the Clanton spear found in UK and dated as being more than 400,000 years and identified as being made of hue. Or the very recent discovery of a 500,000-year-old wooden structure unearthed in Zambia that reveals human-made wooden housing structures. Also in ethnography, the wood identification ethnography is another investigation area where the identification of the wood may be a key to reveal the provenance of species according to the endemic woods of that region, for example. And many, many other areas. General history, for example. What were most used to construct our caravels, for example? Was just one species, was a mix of several species. Material engineering to understand why certain woods were chosen for certain ends, like structures of roofs, etc. International law, with very present issue of the returning certain artistic artifacts to their original countries or not. Criminology, but also dendrochronology, where the previous identification of the woods to be data is key, since different species have different databases and measuring parameters. Now entering into the theme of my PhD, wood identification in artworks. There are several areas within the art world where wood identification has an essential role and application, namely provenance, already mentioned, where wood ID can decisively contribute to resolve provenance issues of an art piece, or authenticity, since it is one of the several techniques used to conclude about the authenticity of a specific art piece. It is essential in conservation and restoration interventions when the goal is to use the same wood species as the ones present in the original piece. For example, to match specific woods that have specific behaviors, such as unique constituents like oils that can make gluing procedures more difficult, or woods with a higher susceptibility to wood movements, for example, or woods that may need better environmentally controlled spaces in order to avoid their natural tendency to photooxidation, or xylophagous or fungal infestations. The reality is that wood identification in artistic objects has as a primal goal the procurement of information that adds to what is known about the piece in question. Often, this information can confirm what is already expected, given the current knowledge about the piece under analysis. But it can also be a turning point when the identification results point to different conclusions than expected. I can give you a few examples. In 1990, Bruce Odloy reports the identification of a Russian icon, presumably of Russian origin and presumably carved from pine or a fruit tree. However, after microscopic identification, it turned out to be a species of Podocarpaceae family, a family of conifers, mostly concentrated in the southern hemisphere, with some species extending to Africa and to the Mediterranean. Or the case of Adrian Kapler, that in 1993 proceeded to the scientific identification of ethnographic Hawaiian wooden pieces that conclude that several previous macroscopic identifications were in fact wrong. Pieces identified as, for example, Acacia koa were in fact Cordia subcordata, or pieces identified as Metrosideros polymorpha turned out to be Autocarpus aulitis. In Portugal, in 2011, several researchers, among them one of my advisors, Dr. José Pissarra, identified wood samples from several Portuguese 18th century furniture pieces, which were all thought to be completely made from Brazilian woods. However, after identification, samples reveal the presence of species from India and Southeast Asia. Finally, Caroline Koch writes that in 2020, during the identification of Roman, Egypt, and Caustic portraits, was surprised with the identification of several European woods, such as lime wood, oak, fir, or yew. Reaction justified by the assumption until then that Cedrus libani was the most frequent imported species for high-status artifacts. Most relevant typologies in art for wood identification are obviously sculpture, furniture, painting on wood, altars, roof structures, and windows, doors, obviously belonging to important buildings, naturally, but also mobile art pieces like royal wooden carriages and religious floats. Limitations for collecting samples from works of art. Getting near the end, when dealing with artworks, an unavoidable fact is that samples collected from wooden pieces must be very small. This limitation has to do with size of the artwork, but also with ethical, aesthetics, and structural issues. and even with commercial value of the art piece. Naturally, sample collecting is facilitated in large volume artworks and when access to the reverse or the inside of the piece is possible. On the other hand, sample collecting is hindered in small volume and freestanding sculptures or entirely polychrome gilded artworks. In addition to the collecting area limitation, the main factors that limited the collection of viable samples from artworks for the purpose of wood species identification are the presence of polychromies as well as the presence of metal leaf, xylophagous insect infestation as well as fungal infections, and previous interventions with the presence of materials such as waxes, consolidation resins, filling pastes, and finally, the crushing of the collecting area. This final issue is very important, in my case particularly, because most of the times the only available area that I have to collect samples from a sculpture is the underface of the base of the sculpture. And as easy to imagine, that is precisely the area that is most damaged and smashed during centuries. So this is one of the main problems that I have. In addition, finally, strategies for collecting samples from artworks. In order to get around to these difficulties, the option is to take samples precisely from the areas affected by these limitations. In that order, despite degradation of the woody material, the collection from areas affected by fungi may have positive results. We have to distinguish between two different types of fungi here. Chromogenic fungi, which is the one that we like the most, because they cause aesthetical changes mostly of the wood surface without relevant damage in the wood structure. However, we also have the saprophytic fungi, which causes modifications in the internal structure of the wood and may, in some cases, result in unviable identifications. Also collecting samples from carbonized areas. The carbonization of wood, if it is not extremely intense, has no particular influence in its internal structure, but simply in the reduction of its volume, which can result in viable identifications. In each case, the volume reduction of the collected samples, which is the main focus of my PhD research, allows collecting samples from a wider range of artworks. However, the viability of the samples is difficult to confirm until it is analyzed. In each case, the manipulation and analysis of small-scale samples frequently require its embedding in resin to allow its handling and especially sectioning. After sectioning, staining, and mounting samples in glass slides, these can be examined with a regular optical microscope. Following this methodology, the samples obtained show a wide range in quality and information, but allow in most cases the identification of the species or, at worst, of the genus. And thank you very much. That's it. I'm now available for any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Oh, and I have so many. Okay, so let's exactly.
Okay.
Right. Meanwhile, I was cold. I had to put on a coat. It's cold. Where are you exactly? In Porto?
No, I'm here in Lisbon, Cruz
Here.
Quebrada, so it's a little bit warmer here.
It's a little bit. Anyway, let's see first if our audience has some questions for you. For the moment, no, please do, because he made an effort, made such a nice preparation, such a nice presentation, and raises and gave so much information. You gave so much information.
Yeah, so much.
From
Yeah, sorry.
AI to so many things I didn't know.
Sorry about that.
No, that's the point. That's precisely the point. You did perfect. So perhaps I can ask myself, I can start. One of the things that fascinates me the most that you talked about, okay, I understand the problem the problem of the difficulty in getting the samples and identifying wood that is 400, I don't know, 1,000 years old and so on, try to identify the tree, basically. And so for art, for the study of art and for conservation. But as you mentioned, this is a much wider problem. So I'm imagining the guys at the airport, you know, trying to go through our luggage and finding objects, artifacts made of wood. And how can they decide if that's illegal, not illegal, and so on, just by looking? Obviously, they're not trained to do that. You know, they're obviously not trained to do that.
Yeah.
And neither do they have a reference collection or a botanist or a biologist or whatever there, and let alone a microscope, a electron microscope. So they don't have that. So at this moment, I'm very intrigued. How do they do it? Do they keep the samples and then go? Do you know how it's done in practice?
Yeah, usually is a big problem, because what they have to do is to retain the piece. It's a sculpture or a log, an entire log.
Yeah,
they have to retain it. And as you know, commerce and business don't like to wait for anything. So the pressure is huge. That's probably the main reason why that project that I mentioned from Madrid, the My app, are being developed, and so much researchers are focusing in artificial intelligence,
right?
Because when the My app is available, essentially what the law enforcement in an airport, for example, will need is just to give a small cut on the wood and take a picture with cell phone and a lens, and the artificial intelligence software will hopefully identify that wood and say, no, this is a protected species, this is not a protected species. And in that way, they can decide if they retain that sample of wood or that log or that sculpture or not. Today is a matter of pressure and speed and in the Netherlands, they even tested, I think it was in the Netherlands, they even tested with dogs. So they train dogs to smell certain species. And surprise,
But work of art, they have all those resins and paint, and it must be very difficult for dogs.
But in art is another question, because in art that wood is already dead for many centuries.
Right.
They are using dogs. They use dogs. They tested dogs, especially for big containers full of wood.
I understand.
Trees.
Full of wood. Of freshly collected trees, right? For the commerce, for the trade. I understand.
And the dogs actually had a very high score in identification.
Really?
Yes. I may be wrong, but I think they get it right like 80% of the times.
No.
Yes.
That's
they
fantastic.
train it like just for 3, 4, 5, 6 species, if I remember correctly. But for that number of species, the dogs achieved that high
success.
Exactly.
No, that's amazing. But the AI, okay, so the software, the machine, I think that you can, I know nothing about it, right? But you can teach a machine to identify as long as you have enormous amount of data. And of course, museums and botanic gardens, they have that data, although probably not at the stage that the machine needs in order to recognize. So what we have is the samples, and we have the identification, so the catalogs. We probably have a photograph, right? Yeah. But not really what is needed, because you said that just the observation would take us to genus, the genus, not to the species level. So in order to do that, it's a huge amount of work also for museums, because they would have to get samples and photograph everything in the electron microscope or whatever, so that you could then feed the AI in order to learn how to identify. You see what I mean? So how are they getting in Madrid the data in order to teach the machine?
Essentially, in Madrid, they are working very, very, very hard to get data from everywhere. Essentially, they are trading information with other xylotechs of other countries. They are using their own xylotechs. They are getting more samples and trading more samples. And they even are trying to use, for example, old pieces. For example, one of the plans that we have is to use old xylotechs that I, for example, in Portugal, will section or clean one of the faces of the wood sample. And they will take a picture, and with that picture, they will feed the system over and over and over and over again. But yes, essentially, is this is using self-learning softwares and always feeding with more and more and more pictures. But that is the main limitation, the feeding part, and that is the part that people are trying to resolve.
Yeah, because the collections are not prepared to that kind. Well, of course, some will have, but it's not a part of the protocol of documenting collections for research to photograph them and a microscopic. So that's interesting. I think it will be a game changer for absolutely. And it's good. Yeah.
Sorry. Go on.
No. Yes.
Because like I said in one of the slides, you have different techniques. Obviously, you have DNA barcoding and other techniques, but those techniques always have one key issue: is they are extremely expensive.
Yes.
Right? They are not available everywhere, and most of the times, if the sample is contaminated with something, they do not work properly. So a situation like this, which is the anatomical analysis of the sample, but with the resource of AI, will be, and I'm sure that will be a game changer.
Totally.
Absolutely game changer.
And it's a good non-worrying, at least for the moment.
One of the few, yes.
Exactly. Use of machine learning. So that's very good. Yeah. Let's see if we have questions on YouTube for the moment. No, so I go on with my curiosity about all these fantastic things you told us about. So one of the things is, in fact, you didn't mention much the reference collection that is required, for works of art. I'm sure there are species that are more used because they are more pliable, more flexible for sculpture, for example, and so on. So in my mind, it would be natural to have a reference collection so that you could at least at the genus level identify the wood. But you didn't mention that much. So I would like you to say again the importance of having such a collection. But I also wanted to add to that another question, which is, what is the point? Explain to us, what is the point of identifying wood? What is the point? I mean, why do you have to? Maybe you don't have to. What is the point for the history of art, for the study of art, for conservation? Can you explain that to everyone?
Yeah, I will start for the last one. Essentially, the point of identifying wood, for example, let's focus in art, is like I said in PowerPoint, for the conservation and restoration of art is extremely important because every species have a different behavior, for absorption or just releasing humidity, they will change and move in different ways. Some species are highly susceptible to photooxidation, so they will change color easily. Some species will accept or not varnishes, because they have an internal oil or you know.
Right.
And
Right.
for an art conservator like myself, most of the pictures that you saw there of sculptures or that painted ceiling, it was restored by me and my wife. That lady that you saw in the furniture picture was my wife in a French castle where we worked for 3 years. Most of these pictures are my work as an art restorer. But as an art restorer, I know, especially in furniture and sculpture, that when you have a certain wood, let's imagine oak, for example, in a sculpture, and for some reason, well, let's just imagine this, for some reason, you're gonna use pine to close an area that is broken, whatever the reason. Those two woods will have absolutely different behaviors.
Right.
And that will cause problems further on.
Right.
That is one of the main situations. In furniture, the colleagues that are specialized in furniture, they know very well that certain woods are very, very alike. That's why macroscopy is useful, but just in a first stage, because certain woods are almost identical. But when you go to microscopy, you can see they are different, and they will behave differently.
So when there's a hole, sorry to interrupt, but when there's a hole in say a chair or a table, whatever that you want to restore, what you do is you fill in the hole with wood, right?
Yes.
And not with other material. You fill it with wood. And the fact that you're putting wood on wood makes it very important that you know which species are each, because otherwise they will compress, expand differently according to the environmental conditions, right?
You even have that with same species, because when you have a sculpture, a 400 years old oak sculpture, and you use a kind of dried, I know, but with 10-year-old dried piece of oak, even those two will behave differently, but at least they have the same levels and set points.
The same band. They operate within a certain behavior is within a band.
Exactly.
It's not like completely different stuff.
Completely different. When you have really different species, sometimes or most of the times you can have problems with that, you know.
Right.
That is one of the main reasons. Like I was saying, the colleagues of furniture that work with the colors of the woods, they have to have that in consideration. The photo-oxidation, for example, or the acceptance of certain varnishes. Certain woods are very difficult to varnish or to polish, for example. And they have to know, because sometimes after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, the furniture is giving problems because the color of the changed wood is bending.
Right.
That is the main situation in art. Now, responding to your first question about the
reference collection
of a reference collection, you would be surprised because there are very few, not just in Portugal, but it was a problem until a few years ago, and suddenly now is rebirthing. The reference collection of wood and herbarium, which is the leaves and flowers, is rebirthing everywhere in the world. Why? Because climate change, one, and the trafficking of protected species.
Sure.
So you are seeing a gradual but very consistent growth in reference collection all over the world, in museums, in laboratories, in hopefully restorations courses and schools, which is what I'm doing in my PhD. Also, is constructing a reference collection, also connected to a website, despite my PhD itself, because one thing does not make sense without the other, you know. It is pointless to develop a work of this length for years of wood identification without building one reference collection inside the School of Restoration, for example, to be accessible to everyone, students or not.
Exactly. I find that very important.
Yes.
There is this indirect, of course, we don't want to give the impression when we are talking about these things that it's kind of easy to identify with all these techniques and so on. It's not clear cut. You have to kind of cross many sources, right?
Exactly.
And there are these indirect sources that I'm curious about, like the animals, the bugs, the pests,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
The xylophagus, and also the fungi. Okay, so each species of wood has its own, creates its own ecosystem of animals and whatever that like to go and chew and eat, you know. So my question is that also, I imagine, gives an indication of the nature of the species of wood or not.
Yeah, true. Here in Portugal, we have several species of, for example, xylophagous insects, several.
Right.
But we know, for example, one is Heliotropo, which is focused or prefers, and in most cases, he only eats conifers. Why?
Right.
Because conifers are softer, right?
Right.
Those xylophagus are bigger, they make audible noises, and they focused on conifers.
It's kind of caruncho. A gente chama caruncho.
Yeah, exactly. Caruncho, exactly. And they focus on conifers, for example. And if you found one of those animals in a certain area, you know that he was most likely eating conifer. But when you go to others, Anubium punctatum, for example, which is the little one, that is called for many people the eternal pest, because they eat everything.
Everything.
They are the smallest ones, and they go to conifers, they go to hardwoods, they even go to the called eternal woods, ebony and pau santo, etc. If they don't have anything else to eat, they will do that.
They are the seagulls. They are the seagulls of the insect world.
Exactly.
They eat everything. Okay.
Everything. And you have certain species that, for example, only eats the sapwood and stop on the hardwood because it's more toxic and harder. And other species like the Anubium punctatum go through everything.
Everything.
Like a drill. Boom.
Okay, I understand.
Yeah, that is possible. Yeah.
That's interesting. So in other words, you have to know a lot. It's an interdisciplinary field. You have to know entomology, you have to know botany. It's incredible. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I have some lucky with that, because my first degree was landscape designing.
Yes.
And I started working in restoration, essentially with wood. Then I went to my first degree. Then the master's degree focused on treatment and sculpture, but with a case study of wood identification. And now I'm entering full on wood identification.
Yeah, you're really into wood identification
of art objects. Yes.
And at what stage of your PhD are you in? Kind of halfway.
Third year of 4.
Okay.
So,
ooh,
yes, I'm getting near the scary part.
You're getting there.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So, I think it's not so much a question, but it's a comment to highlight something you said, which is the issue of provenance.
Yeah.
For already existing collections of artifacts, especially ethnography, anthropology, the importance it is nowadays in museums for the last 5 years, 6 years, especially in Europe, that have collections that have doubtful provenance in the colonial dimension. This will be an important dimension too. It helps. It doesn't give a clear indication because, as you know, you can have trees all over, I don't know, a big area. You can have, they can occur they don't pinpoint to a village, right?
Yeah.
They pinpoint to a big region. So it's one of the many sources that you can use in order to do provenance research, and I think that's very important.
Yes, provenance and authentication both live of several techniques that give different informations that then is our job to put together and create a linear narrative, you know.
Right.
Obviously, provenance, wood identification is one of the tools. Eventually, pigments identification, varnishes identification, the fats or whatever the piece may have, I don't know, feathers of animals, skin.
Right.
Is one of the tools for defined provenance. And because we all know that we have falsifications or certain items that we think that come from a region, but when they are analyzed, we have to conclude that they come from another region.
You gave examples. You gave 3 or 4 examples in your talk of misidentifications based on based on the wood.
And so those misidentifications are not just focused on wood identification, but also in pigments, skins, feathers of animals, whatever is. That's why the constant scientific updates and the reference collections are so important to be maintained and to grow because constant update is the blood of science.
Of course. Constant doubt to start with, and then update, and then criticized, self-criticized, and discussed.
Critical thinking.
Yeah. So, Luis, just to finish, because people are not curious. I cannot believe this audience.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's the time and the day of the week.
Yeah, it's the time and the day of the week. So I have some spam here, but I think it's okay. We'll leave it. But my final question is this. So you are working in a highly specialized field, interdisciplinary, we already discussed that, but highly specialized. And also it's a niche. It's kind of a niche.
Yeah.
Although there are the broader dimension of the traffic and airports and so on, but how do you think your field will look like in 20 years with this enormous development in technologies?
That is a very, very, very difficult question, because in reality I really hope, I will not say what I think, I really hope that this field is more complete. In other words, that the crisscrossing about different techniques and above all sciences, biology, art conservation, ethnography, paleontology, archaeology are easier, you know, that people are more willing to trade and to ask questions and to trade information, to trade subjects. At the same time, using science resources will turn this field in 20 years absolutely impossible to recognize. You know, it will be absolutely different. I'm sure that will be absolutely different, because this situation that we have now with climate change and trafficking of animals and woods, etc., will not change anytime soon, will not stop anytime soon. And in my specific field, my niche, the identification in art objects, can contribute seriously to the field, because I only deal with very degraded or small samples or very old wood. Naturally, what I know is usable in the identification in a fresh wood. That is paradise to me, because it's easier. But my contribution will be, how can we achieve the same results with less smaller samples, with less damage to the work, and with fewer tools? That is my hope.
Fewer ethical issues also, as you mentioned also. So on that note, I think we finished brilliantly. Thank you so much, Luis. Thank you so much. And we wish you all the best for your PhD, which will be brilliant. I can tell already, but you have to work, huh? You have to work.
I'm on it.
You're on it, I know. You got it.
Yeah.
But and thank you also for all our audience online and the ones who will see it later.
Okay.
And I hope to see you in one of our next seminars, which will be, usually the seminars are the last Monday of the month. I don't know if it's the case today. What is it? Yeah, exactly. It's the last Monday of the month at 5 p.m. Lisbon time. So thank you so much and join us again next time. Thank you, Luis.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye to everyone.